The porch light at my son's house had one of those warm yellow bulbs that made everything look like a memory before it even happened. I remember standing on the lawn at his 40th birthday holding a paper plate with a slice of grocery store cake on it, watching the small crowd of people I'd known for 30 years act like I wasn't there. That's when my daughter-in-law walked over, glass of white wine in her hand, and said it loud enough for the back patio to hear. "Pop, it's almost cute how you keep showing up. A man your age, no job, no wife, no money. Without this family, you'd be sleeping in your truck." She laughed. Not a cruel laugh. Worse than that, the laugh of somebody who genuinely believed she was being warm. I didn't say anything. I never do. That's something my late wife used to call my biggest weakness and my best feature, depending on what kind of week we were having. I just looked at her, then at the cake, then at the string of lanterns my son had hung between the oak tree and the back of the garage, and I said, "Thanks for having me, sweetheart." Then I drove home. Home at that time was a little gray house off Route 9 in eastern Pennsylvania, the kind of place with a sloping porch and a kitchen that hadn't been updated since the second Bush administration. My daughter-in-law had been in that house exactly twice, once when my wife was dying, and once after the funeral, to ask if there was anything valuable she might want to take off our hands. Her words, "off our hands." She didn't take anything. There was nothing she wanted. I sat on my porch that night with a cup of black coffee and thought about her words for a long time. Not because they hurt. They did, but I'd been hurt worse. I thought about them because they were the loudest thing anyone had said to me in maybe 2 years, and I realized something kind of strange. She believed it. She actually believed she was the reason I hadn't fallen off the side of the earth. A man learns a lot of things in 67 years on this planet, but one of them is this. When somebody tells you who they think you are, the kindest thing you can do sometimes is let them keep believing it, for a little while, until you decide it's time to stop. I should explain how we got here. My son, the birthday boy, his name is the one I gave him, and his mother and I raised him in a town so small it didn't have a stoplight until 2003. We weren't rich. We weren't poor. We were the kind of family where Sunday meant church, then pot roast, then his mother and I doing the crossword on the couch while he did his homework on the floor. He was a good boy. He grew into a good young man. He went to community college, then a state school, and he met her in his junior year. I'll call her by what she called herself the first time we sat down to dinner. She introduced herself, smiled at my wife, and said, "I'm the future of this family." I thought she was joking. My wife knew better. My wife always knew better. She squeezed my knee under the table and didn't say a word. They got married in a barn that cost more than the first house I ever bought. I wore a suit I'd had since 1989, and she made a comment about it being vintage, in a tone that wasn't a compliment. My wife wore a navy dress and the pearl earrings I gave her on our 25th, and she looked to me like the most beautiful woman in any room she'd ever walked into. She always did. After the wedding, things shifted. My daughter-in-law had what people now call a strong personality. She took over Christmas. She took over Thanksgiving. She decided which restaurant we went to for my son's birthday and which side of the table I was allowed to sit on. My wife let it happen because she said, and I'll never forget this, "He picked her, honey. We don't get a vote." So I didn't vote. I just watched. Then my wife got sick. I'm not going to walk you through that part. I'll tell you that it took 11 months. And I'll tell you that I sold my truck to cover what insurance wouldn't. And I'll tell you that during those 11 months, my daughter-in-law visited the hospital exactly 3 times, 2 of which were less than 10 minutes long. The 3rd time, she brought my son and a casserole, and she stood in the doorway of the room and said, "I just can't be in here. It's too sad for me." My wife looked at her from the bed and smiled, because that was the kind of woman my wife was, and she said, "Honey, it's all right. Go on home." After my wife passed, my son came over to the house once a week for about 2 months, then once every 2 weeks, then once a month. Then she started sending him with little reasons not to stay long. The kids had soccer. They had a dinner. There was a thing. I understood. I really did. He was building a life. That's what kids do. You raise them so they can leave you, and if you raise them right, they leave you well. He left me well enough. But she made sure he left me completely. Around the second year after my wife passed, she started telling people I was struggling. That's the word she used, struggling. She'd say it with her head tilted, the way people do when they want you to feel sorry for them for telling you something. She'd tell my niece, my brother, the people from the old church, Pop is really struggling out there in that house. We worry about him. He can't really take care of himself. He won't ask for help. None of that was true. I'm not a man of fortune, but I'm not a man in need. I worked 41 years as a structural engineer. I designed bridges, real ones, the kind you've probably driven over without ever thinking about who made sure they wouldn't fall. I retired at 62 with a pension, a paid-off house, and savings my wife and I had built together one paycheck at a time, both of us packing our own lunches every day for 40 years. I drive an old truck because I like it, not because I have to. I wear flannels because I like them. I eat eggs and toast for dinner sometimes because, after 67 years, I can. But she made me into a story. The struggling old man, the lonely widower who was one bad winter away from a nursing home. She liked that story. I think it made her feel important. Generous. Like she was the daughter-in-law who'd taken in the falling apart father-in-law, even though she'd never taken me in for a single night and never offered to. What I didn't tell her, what I didn't tell anybody, was what my wife and I had been doing in those last few years before she got sick. We bought a piece of land. It was about 2 hours from where we lived, up in the hills, 26 acres of mostly woods with a creek running through it and a meadow at the south end, where you could see, on a clear day, 3 counties. We bought it in 2014 for less than what my daughter-in-law's wedding photographer charged. My wife had this dream ever since she was a girl of a stone farmhouse, real stone, not the fake stuff, with a porch wide enough to dance on and a kitchen big enough to feed 20. So we started building. Slow. Real slow. I did most of the work myself, with help from a couple of old friends from my engineering days and a young contractor down the road who took to me like a grandson and charged me a fraction of what he should have. We poured the foundation in 2015, framed it in 2016, repicked the stone, every piece of it, from a quarry up near the New York border. My wife got to see it framed and roofed. She got to stand in what would be the kitchen, and she got to put her hand on the rough wall, and she got to cry one time, just once, and tell me, "We did it, honey. We really did it." She didn't get to see it finished. I finished it without her. Took me 3 more years. I'd drive up Friday after Friday, sleep in the unfinished house on a cot, and I'd lay stone by hand, the way she wanted, the way she'd shown me in those magazines she used to dog-ear at the kitchen table. I wore through 5 pairs of work gloves. I wore through one knee. I had the surgery, took 2 months off, and went right back at it. By the time my daughter-in-law was laughing at me on the lawn at my son's birthday party, telling me I'd be sleeping in my truck without her, I had been living, on weekends, in a 3,400 square foot stone farmhouse with my wife's name on the deed alongside mine, sitting on 26 acres of land that had appreciated quite a bit since 2014. I never told my son about it. I'm going to be honest with you. I should have. That's a regret of mine. I had reasons. Some of them were good, and some of them were just my own pride. The good reason was that my wife and I had decided before she passed that the house would be a surprise. Something I'd give him and his family for one Christmas when it was all done and finished and full of furniture and her recipes in the kitchen drawer. The pride reason was that by the time the house was ready, I didn't trust her, my daughter-in-law, with the knowledge of it. I didn't trust her not to put her hands on it. I didn't trust her not to make it about her. So I held on to it. For about a year after the birthday party, I didn't see them much. My son called on holidays. He sent me a Father's Day card that I'm pretty sure she signed for him. I got a Christmas photo of the grandkids in matching pajamas, and on the back, in her handwriting, it said, "Hope you're hanging in there, Pop. Love, the family. The family." Like I wasn't part of it. Then in February of last year, my son called me. His voice was different. Quiet. He said, "Dad, can I come see you this weekend?" "Just me?" I said, "Of course." He came on Saturday morning. He looked older than I remembered. He sat at my kitchen table and he drank the coffee I made him, and after about 20 minutes of small talk, he put his cup down and he said, "Dad, I think I'd made some mistakes. I didn't say anything. I just waited." He told me his marriage was struggling. He told me she was spending money they didn't have. He told me she'd taken out a second mortgage on their house without him knowing, against his name because he'd signed something a year ago he hadn't read carefully. He told me she'd been telling people, his sister, his cousins, his coworkers, that he was the reason for all their problems, that he was lazy, that he was disconnected, that he didn't make enough. And then, with his voice cracking, he said, "Dad, she told me last week that without her, I'd be nothing, just like you." I felt something in my chest then. Not anger. Something quieter than anger. Something more like a door closing. "Son," I said, "do you believe her?" He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "I don't know what I believe anymore." I nodded. I poured him more coffee. And I said, "Why don't you come up and see me next Saturday? Just you. I want to show you something." He came up the next Saturday. I told him to meet me at a gas station off the highway 2 hours north. He parked his SUV next to my truck and got in with me. And we drove the last 20 minutes through the back roads, past farms and barns and frozen creeks, and we turned onto a long gravel driveway that wound up through a stand of oaks, and we came around the last bend, and there it was, the house his mother dreamed about. Stone. 3 stories. A wraparound porch. Smoke coming out of the chimney because I had lit a fire that morning. The meadow behind it covered in snow. 26 acres of nothing but quiet. He didn't speak for a full minute. I don't think he was breathing, honestly. He just sat in the truck, looking at it through the windshield, and when he finally turned to me, his face was wet. "Dad," he said. "Whose is this?" I said, "Your mother's and mine. And someday, if you live right, yours." He cried then, real crying, the kind that men our age don't do often, and almost never in front of each other. I let him. I sat there in the truck with my old hands on the steering wheel, and I let my boy cry because he hadn't gotten to say goodbye to his mother the way he wanted to, and he hadn't gotten to know what she and I were building, and he was finding it all out at once, in a driveway, in February, in a place she'd loved before she ever set foot on it. I took him inside. I made him coffee in the big kitchen with the soapstone counters my wife had picked out from a catalog. I showed him the room she'd planned for the grandkids, with the window seat that looked out at the meadow. I showed him the bookshelves I'd built by hand. I showed him in the upstairs hallway the small framed photo of his mother standing in the kitchen when it was still framing in dust, her hand on the wall, smiling at me through tears. He stayed 3 days. On the 3rd night, sitting by the fire, he said, "Dad, why didn't you tell me?" I thought about it for a while. I thought about telling him the easy answer, that we'd wanted it to be a surprise. That was true, but it wasn't all of it. I said, "Son, your wife told a lot of people I was struggling. She told you too." And I let her because I figured one day the truth would get its own chance to talk. I didn't want to be the one to start that fight. I wanted you to come find it on your own. He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "Dad, I was a coward." I said, "No, son. You were just married to somebody who needed you to be smaller than you are. That happens to good men sometimes. The question is what you do next." He went home Monday morning. I won't tell you everything that happened after that because some of it isn't my story to tell, but I'll tell you the part that is. About 6 weeks later, my son called me and said his wife wanted to come see me. She'd heard somehow about the house. I don't know who told her. Maybe my son did eventually. Maybe one of the cousins. Word travels. She wanted to come up. She had something she wanted to say. I said, all right. She came on a Saturday in April. The dogwoods on the property were just starting. She drove up alone in the new car my son had told me she'd bought without asking him. She got out, in heels she shouldn't have worn on gravel, and she stood at the edge of the driveway and looked up at the house for a long, long time. I was on the porch, in my work jacket, with a cup of coffee. She walked up the steps slowly. She didn't say hello. She just looked around, at the porch, at the stone, at the brass numbers I'd hung by the door, at the wreath my granddaughter had made me last fall, and I hadn't taken down. Her face went through about 4 expressions in 20 seconds, and not one of them was the face I'd seen at my son's birthday party. She finally said, almost in a whisper, "Pop, this can't be. This is yours." I said, "Mine and your mother-in-law's." She picked the stone. She stood very still. I could see her trying to do the math in her head. The acreage, the build, the land, what it must be worth now. What it must be worth. what that meant about every story she'd ever told about me. She said, "I didn't know." I said, "I know you didn't." She said, "Pop, I owe you." I stopped her. I didn't do it harsh. I didn't even raise my voice. I've never been a man who raises his voice. I just held up my hand, the one not holding the coffee, and I said, "Sweetheart, I don't need your apology. I don't need your explanation, and I don't need you to tell anybody back home that you were wrong about me. Because here's the thing. I'm not going to be in your story anymore. Not the bad version. Not the good version. Not any version." She started to cry. Real tears, I think. Or maybe the kind of tears you cry when you realize the room you've been performing in is emptied out and nobody's clapping. I said, "You were unkind to a man who buried his wife. You told my son he was nothing. You told yourself a story where you were the only thing keeping this family together, when the truth is, you were the only thing pulling it apart. I'm not angry at you. I'm too old to be angry, but I'm done." She said, "Pop, please, don't." I said, "You're going to drive home now. You're going to talk to my son. The two of you are going to figure out what kind of marriage you want, or whether you want one at all. That's not my business. But this house and this land and what your mother-in-law and I built, that is my business. And it's not going to be part of any conversation you have about me ever again. Are we clear?" She nodded. She couldn't speak. I walked her back to her car. I opened the door for her, the way my father taught me to open a door for any woman, even one who'd called me nothing on a lawn in front of 30 people. She got in. She put her hands on the wheel and stared straight ahead. Before I closed the door, I leaned down a little. I said, "One more thing. The next time you tell somebody about me, tell them the truth. I'm doing fine. I've always been doing fine, and I never needed you to keep me alive." I closed the door. She drove away. I want to tell you that I felt some big rush of victory, but that's not how it went. I sat back down on the porch. I drank my coffee. I watched a hawk circle over the meadow for a while, and I thought about my wife and how she would have stood next to me through that whole conversation, and how she wouldn't have said a single word, and how she would have squeezed my hand at the end of it and said, "Honey, I'm proud of you. Now come inside. The bread's almost done." The marriage didn't survive. I won't pretend I'm sorry. My son moved into the farmhouse with me for about 4 months while he sorted things out. We fixed the back fence together. We cleared a section of the woods. He learned how to lay stone. Badly at first, then a little better. The grandkids came up most weekends. My granddaughter found my wife's old recipe box in a drawer and asked me if we could make her grandma's banana bread. And I'm not going to tell you what that did to me, but I'll tell you we made the bread. It came out just like her grandmother's. It always does. I think the recipe knows. My son and I don't talk about his ex-wife much anymore. There's not much to say. Last I heard, she'd moved to a town 2 states over and told everyone there a new story about her life. I hope, for her sake, the new story is kinder to whoever she's putting in the role of the villain. I hope she knows eventually that she didn't lose us because we were cruel. She lost us because we got tired. A man my age can spend a lot of time being told who he is by people who never bothered to look. He can spend years sitting at the wrong end of a table at the wrong kind of dinner, holding his tongue because the woman he loves has asked him to keep the peace. He can bury that woman, and he can keep holding his tongue because he's gotten so used to it that the silence feels like the last piece of her he's still carrying. But there comes a day, and it doesn't always come with a fight. Sometimes it comes with a porch and a cup of coffee and a woman in heels on gravel looking up at a house she didn't believe could exist. And on that day, a man can put down the silence just for one quiet sentence. And he can pick it back up after, if he wants. The silence isn't gone. It's still his. It's just on his terms now. The house is still standing. The stone wall my wife picked out is going to outlast me, and it's going to outlast my son. And I hope, with a little luck, it's going to outlast my grandkids' grandkids. I had her name carved into the cornerstone, low down, where you have to kneel to read it. Most people don't notice it. That's the way she would have wanted it. I sit out on that porch most evenings now. I drink my coffee, even when the doctor tells me not to. I watch the hawks. Sometimes my son sits with me. Sometimes one of the grandkids does. Sometimes it's just me and the dog I rescued last spring, an old hound who doesn't ask anything of me except a hand on his head. And every now and then, when the wind comes up off the meadow just right, I'll think about that birthday party, the lanterns, the grocery store cake, the laugh, the voice telling me what I was without her. I don't wince anymore when I remember it. I just smile a little, not unkindly, just the way you smile at a thing that used to scare you when you finally realize it never had any teeth. She was wrong about a lot of things, but she was wrong about a lot of things, but she was wrong about one big thing most of all. I was never nothing. I was just quiet. I've thought a lot in the years since that afternoon on the porch about how a person ends up where they end up, not in the lucky sense, in the earned sense. My daughter-in-law didn't just wake up one morning and decide she was going to lose her marriage and her place in our family. She built that ending herself, one small choice at a time, the same way my wife and I built that stone house, one stone at a time. The difference is we knew what we were building. She didn't. Every unkind word she said about me at a dinner table she hadn't paid for, every story she told about me struggling, when the truth was she'd never once asked me how I was. Every time she rolled her eyes at my old truck, my old flannel, my old way of doing things, those weren't just moments, they were stones. She was laying her own foundation, and the house she built on it was a small one and a lonely one. And in the end, it couldn't hold her marriage, couldn't hold my son, couldn't hold even her own version of herself. What I want you to understand, if you've watched this far, is that I'm not telling you this story to be proud. I'm telling it because I learned something I wish somebody had told me when I was younger. Character is the only thing in this life that compounds the way money does. Every honest day's work I put in, every time I held my tongue when my wife asked me to, every weekend I drove 2 hours up that road to lay another row of stone for a woman I was already losing, all of that was earning interest, even when nobody was watching, especially when nobody was watching. That's the part younger folks miss sometimes. They think the proof has to come fast. They think if nobody's clapping, you must be doing it wrong. But the truth I learned late and slow is that a quiet life lived honestly is a kind of savings account. You don't see it, you don't brag about it. And then one Saturday in April, somebody you love or somebody who hurt you drives up your gravel driveway and finds out who you've actually been the whole time. I want my grandkids to know that. I want them to know that being kind isn't weakness. Holding your tongue isn't cowardice when you do it for the right reasons. And working on something nobody's praising you for is how you find out what kind of man you really are. My wife knew it. She was the one who taught it to me. Every quiet morning of 46 years. If you take anything from an old man tonight, take this. Don't waste your life proving wrong the people who don't matter. Build the thing they don't believe you can build. Then live in it. Then forgive them if you can. And walk away clean if you can't. The house will still be there. So will you. And the silence you carried all those years won't feel like a weight anymore. It'll feel like a roof.